Very good morning, everyone. Welcome to stream 2 of the digital energy breakout session. So I'm delighted to be joined by our first speaker, Johnny from Darktrace. For those of you who don't know Darktrace, they're an AI-driven cybersecurity company. Worked with us for a number of years. I'm delighted to say since the very, very early days of their inception, and proud sponsors of the McLaren Formula One team. Johnny won't tell me if he gets free tickets or not, but I'll get it out of them by the end of the session. Johnny's going to be talking about leveraging AI to mitigate attacks on OT systems, a very, very relevant point in the current climate with the increased threat activities. So, Johnny, I'm going to hand over to yourself now, and at the end of the session, if you do want to go and speak to the Darktrace team on their stand, they're welcome to do so. Johnny, over to you.
Well, that was a lovely introduction. Thanks, Ray. Yeah, lovely to meet all of you relatively virtually. So yeah, I'm Johnny. I'm an account director at Darktrace. Now, I'm very aware account director means so many different things. It almost means as much as someone that is in IT. Now, what it essentially means at Darktrace is I work with my team that, work with oil and gas, manufacturing, energy companies, education, universities, any sector really, anyone that has data or systems that they want to protect, to make sure that they are as happy using the software as they are on day one, as they are on day 999. But what that does mean is that we hear a lot of stories or threats that people are concerned about or challenges. So the intention of this virtual discussion is really to explore how AI is going to be leveraged to initiate a new wave of cyber attacks in the OT environment specifically, and the approach that needs to be used to mitigate that risk for continuity of operations, systems, and all the rest of it. Now, what does that actually look like? So first of all, why even have the need for having this discussion in the first place? What does that evolving ICS threat landscape look like? Then, what is the history of the attacks that have happened that are in the news increasingly? Then from experience, what is coming in terms of AI-powered attacks? And then rounding off with, what approach is required to resolve this risk effectively? And then obviously not taking my word for it because I'm paid by Darktrace to make it sound incredible, examples of this working out in the wild with actual clients as well. So why are we even here in the first place? And again, preaching to the choir because each and every single one of you knows your challenges best. So some of this may be relevant, some of it may not, but typically at least one of these kind of challenges that people or companies have had over 2020 is pretty pertinent. So essentially across, oil, critical infrastructure, energy, the challenges that these CIOs, IT directors, heads of security have had through 2020 and beyond are: one, ransomware is increasingly powerful. Organizations in our space have been impacted and they've struggled to respond quickly. Two, everyone is largely remote. Don't know why. Seems to have happened from about a year ago. So insider threat has taken on this totally new dimension. And then what's more, we've got this hybrid environment with cloud opening up new risks from insiders as well, whether they know it or not, which leads us on to three, which is people tend to be less security conscious in a global pandemic. So employee error is also a massive problem, not just outwardly looking for malicious insider threats. Next, lots of attackers, especially nation state attacks, are pretty slow and quiet, and they blend into our environment, and the traditional perimeter tools in place haven't been able to detect this stuff. And then to top it off, the common phrase is, well, look, there's tools in our cars, there's tools anywhere that use AI for good or the good of mankind. How long is it going to be until there is AI that is used for bad by malicious actors to optimize their attacks in OT environments or our environments? They're going to be more targeted and they're going to be faster to deploy. So all in all, that's an ever-changing landscape of quite aggressive threats, which ultimately means that people are like, look, this is harder for our security team or our IT function that has remit of security using these tools that we have around the perimeter to fundamentally keep up. So that's the problem that we have. Now, Before we go into fast forwarding what the next few years looks like, let's take a step back and review what's happened over the last 10 years and the evolution of attacks that have happened. Now, essentially, we all know spear phishing is the most common initial vector to get malware past firewalls, but also watering hole attacks where a third-party website is compromised, or malware from a physical media like a USB. And that some examples of those attacks are on this timeline here, and I think there's a talk about Ekans coming up as well later. But fundamentally, Stuxnet, patient zero origin of ICS attacks, that was thought to be deployed manually on a USB stick. Havex, access systems through a variety of methods, including watering hole. Black Energy, able to perform reconnaissance. Once they'd found their ideal target, the attackers directed botnets to conduct distributed denial of service or DDoS attacks in a highly targeted fashion. And then most recently, Triton, very much like recent attacks against OT, like Ekans, exploited the convergence of IT with OT by compromising enterprise devices before pivoting into OT subnets. So the Triton framework, however, still requires operators of the malware to manually trigger its functions through scripts. Now, in the future, what we're anticipating is an AI-equipped version of an ICS attack operating without the human element, which is the command and control, and then basically only calling back at the end of the initial reconnaissance phase. So that probably nicely leads on to what else is next. What are these trends that we're kind of seeing emerge over the last year and increasingly common into 2021 and beyond? By and large, it's kind of three main categories, which is commodity malware, not relying on command and control, and then ultimately using machine learning software to do that. Probably the most striking is the first one, which is the shift from bespoke malware for specific OT targets like Stuxnet or Havex to commodity malware for generic IT systems, which then append small OT specific modules like the Triton attack or Triton 2.0, if and when it comes. What that means is the cost and the range of expertise to create this OT targeting malware has then been reduced, or is being reduced over time, because the bad guys are getting better at what they do. And as a result, that means that OT threats, rather than being this pretty niche concern, are a central part of the threat landscape, because for a number of reasons, which we're getting into. So what they've seen and what clients have seen fundamentally are increased cases of OT networks that have been affected by malware that was never even intended or specialized for them, such as WannaCry. Now, obviously, traditional corporate networks are a more obvious target for criminals for a number of reasons. One, they can make a quick return on investment, as development costs of an attack of that nature are far lower than those intended purely for OT. But this shift from mainly focusing on IT to then thinking we just want to get anything is going to be very, very quick if these generic IT attacks can then just be easily ported into OT environments. And then finally, what we're seeing is early signs of machine learning being utilized across every single step of that kill chain. So some examples that we've seen are AI chatbots that very scarily, realistically befriend employees during reconnaissance, neural network scanners that automatically select only relevant material during data exfiltration. Every stage of the kill chain, essentially, that we've seen can be augmented with some level of autonomous decision making, and essentially means that it can do its best to very, very seamlessly blend into the environment without the need for human interaction or command and control. And that leads very nicely onto these attacks are going to further reduce their chances of detection as that need for command and control is completely eliminated. Why? Because if you've got a piece of AI or a piece of tech that is able to make decisions by itself and it can adapt, then essentially what you're delaying or fully removing is that need for a human element, so they can operate completely independently from the IT environment into the OT environment when it's learned that it's communicating with an OT control system. And then subsequently, as a result, that is a really significant challenge for most current detection methods that teams will use in their tech stack. So before we kind of go into, what could Triton 2.0 or what does the future look like for these attacks and the implications of development of offensive AI, put yourself in the shoes of a modern cyber criminal, right? Think about their motivations. Then ultimately what we can all do is postulate how they'd want to use AI in 3 categories. So 1, you'd want to be really persistent. So from secondary infections on a single device, or rapidly spreading across the entire network. So one method is, and that we've seen or is potentially becoming more prevalent, is log manipulation, which is a recent technique targeting SIEM log analysis detection approaches, where essentially you block or alter logs before they leave the infected device, which are events that the IT team would want to see to know something's going on. And if they're never processed, the attack goes unnoticed. So obviously visibility is the key to mitigating any risk, because you don't know what you don't know. And if you're only seeing one part of the infection, persistence mechanisms are much more likely to succeed. Now 2, if you're a modern day cyber criminal, you also want to use polymorphism. So code that reprograms itself to avoid up-to-date AV or antiviruses and IDS signatures. So you'd want to be using software components that have a polymorphic factor, and these are already easily purchasable. So they're already here, meaning malware changes every single time it spreads. Ultimately, what that then means is it avoids rules and signatures-based technologies, and it's a real challenge developing a signature that can reliably detect this ever-changing line of code, right? And then 3, if you're a modern-day cyber criminal, you're going to want to do this for 2 reasons. 1, power, or 3. 1, power, 2, political, or 3, most commonly, monetization. So the anonymity of cryptocurrency has made this process so much easier. And as a result, ransomware, crypto mining, malware are ever prevalent. And this also plays into the other piece of why you'd want to be persistent, because the longer that you can crypto mine, the more profitable your attack has been. So now that we know these 3 things, or these 3 areas that we want to consider, we can then postulate what an AI-based Triton 2.0 would look like. And essentially, there'll be 3 key stages that we can hypothesize. So the first is, of course, reconnaissance. Typically here, there are actions that malware can perform to trigger detection, right? So like scanning to identify targets, mapping the network to identify gateways or firewalls, and then downloading of PLC programming for further analysis in an OT environment. So 1, if one of those violates unknown detection rules or makes a device deviate from expected behavior, game over, you've been detected. And then 2, essentially, if it's an AI-enabled framework, you can analyze network communication from the compromised host and then try to passively construct a network map from the limited network traffic that you're seeing. And ultimately, what that means is if you've got multiple infected hosts from this attack, they can then form a peer-to-peer observation network in an attempt to piece together a more comprehensive picture. Stage 2 would then be gaining access. So example, reprogramming a PLC from a particular host that might violate logical zoning requirements. So what you would need to do is, attempting to access a safety device from a random workstation might be possible due to insufficient segmentation, but it can still trigger a rule-based alert that instantly game over, stop. So then ultimately what you can use AI to do is understand the common communication paths, allowing, mapping of conduits and then plausible behavior types throughout the network. If it's a distributed framework with multiple compromised hosts, then that risk associated with taking that action can be calculated, and then the least likely to be detected can be leveraged. That host can be used. Or if ultimately during that evaluation stage, there's no course of action found that meets that minimum risk requirement in that AI, then the malware just re-enters reconnaissance mode, finds alternative paths, spreads laterally to find a better pivot point. And then thirdly is obviously persistence. So Triton, previous OT attacks have regularly polled infected controllers to check on continued persistence, which is unstable and can be avoided with AI modules. So future malware could evaluate whether persistence has been lost by attempting to identify possible reprogramming and update events in the environment itself. And then essentially based on that, it can then make an intelligent decision to only check the status of controllers based on these changes that would then indicate persistence had been lost. So to recap, the risk of bad guys getting better and removing as much of that human element in an attack as possible and creating malware that does decision-making itself and is pretty autonomous is a genuine concern, even according to the World Economic Forum last year. So then the question that most people will ask or say is, look, Johnny, we have solutions, or aren't there solutions in place that already stop this stuff? And yes, there are absolutely rules, signatures-based perimeter defense technologies that base their entire success on detecting and responding at machine speed to these known bads, essentially meaning they look at a data set of a line of code or a domain, if it's in the enterprise IT environment, of if it's happened to someone else, it can't happen to me because we already know that this has had a negative impact. So there's a static rule or signature to say, no, block this. And what that does is really important. No one at Darktrace is ever going to say, rip out your firewall, get rid of your email filter, and just use this AI because it's the solution to all your problems. That is absolutely bonkers. Because that is a really important data set that's being looked at that filters out 80% of the lower level noise and the known stuff. But what it doesn't do with digital environments becoming more complex, with spear phishing, with malicious insiders, is it doesn't look at this entirely different data set of what if it's never happened to anyone before, or what if it is, as I've just said, a malicious insider who's already regarded as safe on the network. Essentially, as a strategy, you have to operate under the assumption that even though you've got a very strong perimeter, which is fantastic, you need to have a detection-based option B under the assumption that eventually something's going to get through this, in the equivalent of most houses have locks on the doors and safes, but you'd also have a burglar alarm. So eventually something is going to get in. And as I've mentioned, looking at the default of working out how you're going to work out when something is in means that you can't look at this data set of known bads because the very nature is it's unknown. So that means that you have to look at a very, very different data set. And in short, that's exactly what Darktrace does by looking at not what the bad guys have done or are doing. We just look at what, in theory, the good guys, yourselves, are doing, and all of the devices and all of your users on your environment, and building an understanding of what fundamentally is normal. So what that looks like is this fundamentally new approach to IoT, which is fundamentally everything that Darktrace Industrial is and does. And the way that it works is it essentially mimics our own immune systems. So just like our own bodies don't have any rules or signatures to say, look, this is what a virus looks like, this is what a bacteria looks like, they just understand our own sense of self. And then what that then means is, if anything enters our bodies, it is surgically know that it's foreign, that it's unknown, and it's dealt with in this surgical targeted fashion. And that's exactly what the AI does for your environment. Now, this is where I use fancy words like unsupervised machine learning, which fundamentally just means it just learns on the job. It's just maths with marketing thrown on top, really. It fundamentally just builds an understanding of all of your devices and all of your users, and is constantly adapting. So once it's installed, which takes a matter of hours, it just gets better and better and it matures over time. And the benefit of that is that because it's not using any preconceived knowledge of what normal is, it doesn't really matter what protocols and technologies are used between these manufacturing, these oil plants, whether it's, Modbus or BACnet or whatever, it doesn't really mind. It's able to understand everything of what's fundamentally normal for each device and what's not. And fundamentally what that looks like in terms of everything that Darktrace is these boxes at the bottom are just where can clients install this AI if they want to. So essentially, whether that's in your email environment, in SaaS, so Zoom, Teams, Office 365, on the endpoint, as people have moved into the cloud, and then yes, all the way down to IoT and OT devices and SCADA networks. And these boxes essentially just mean that's where data is collected from, fed into this immune system approach. The maths then figures out what is normal and what's not, without any preconceived notion of what good and bad is, just an understanding of your sense of self for your environment. And then essentially what that means is that you've got one unified view across all of your, enterprise IT infrastructure and your OT infrastructure that's detecting anything anomalous without heavy tuning. It just learns on the job. What that then means is you've also got AI that's automating up the meaningful task list when it comes to cybersecurity, because one of the biggest things is we have limited resource. Like maybe we are a security function, maybe we're an IT team with security as part of our remit. But if we can automate up that meaningful task list using AI, we stand in the best position to defend against tomorrow's attacks. And ultimately what those meaningful task lists are, as I've just mentioned, automated detection of anything unknown. So it doesn't matter whether it's never been seen before. By nature, it's going to be anomalous to the rest of your normal. It then also means that you've got AI that's taking action and automatically responding for you out of hours, providing a 24/7 operation and enforcing that normal pattern of life that's been learnt in the form of antigena. And then in the middle, what you've also got is up that step further of the meaningful task list. AI analyst, which clues in the name, is automating that investigation using and looking at the technologies that you're using in your stack to pull all of these alerts together and give a holistic view at machine speed of everything that's happened and everything that you need to do. So in essence, teams with typically limited resource, a cyber skills gap, start from this point of action. They've bought themselves time. You don't need to do the manual investigation. You know exactly what you need to do to remediate this unknown threat. And it's been contained by AI and the normal pattern of life has been enforced. Now, typically the next question is, okay, well, how is that set up? Like, how are you going to have this unified view of absolutely everything from our OT environment to our IT environment as these become more converged? And typically, rough diagram here, although obviously this is bespoke to every single client, but generally speaking, the most simple is we have an appliance that spans your core switch via port mirroring, or it can be set up completely virtually in the cloud as well. But what it fundamentally means is once this is set up, which genuinely takes a matter of hours, because it's unsupervised and it's learning on the job, you leave it alone and it self-learns and it's figuring out what's fundamentally normal for your own organization and what's not. And the time to value is not months, it's literally a matter of days. Now, the next question that people ask is, okay, well, there's this AI, it's learning what's normal. Well, hey, Johnny, what if we've already got something that's low and slow that we didn't know about on our environment already? Isn't your AI going to realize that that's normal and then we actually haven't solved anything because we're still compromised? In short, no. We've seen this in multiple examples, and probably this is the best one that I could think of, where in a manufacturing plant in EMEA very recently, you know, they had 5,000 devices they installed for a proof of concept or a proof of value, which is what we call. And within a matter of hours, the AI saw a series of pre-existing infections in a very small number of these 5,000 devices that was attempting to spread and demonstrating worming malware behavior. And the way that the AI basically can figure this out in hours or whenever is it's using clustering techniques to cluster devices or users in your email and SaaS environment that behave similarly together. That cluster then gets smaller and smaller and smaller over time. But fundamentally, it's going to do this from the very second that it's installed. And what that then generated was within the first few hours, the industrial immune system had notified the IT team of these devices that weren't behaving similarly as the other ones in their cluster that are demonstrating this worming malware activity. So they can then the team could then perform incident response, investigate before the attacker could cause damage. Now, it wasn't clear how long these devices had been infected, but it was likely that these were introduced via an infected USB. And because the endpoints affected were used as part of a continuous production process, they couldn't be installed with endpoint protection. So if they didn't have this AI figuring out what was anomalous, there's literally no defense because there is no rules and signatures-based technology possible to put there. Now, the other key example for the purpose of time is, an example of a compromised AC control system that we found in another proof of concept very recently, where essentially it's a utilities company, an AC control system was making a really large number of connections over an unusual comms communications channel from multiple devices outside the network, and actually from an entirely different country, pretty exotic, won't name it. But fundamentally what the AI saw was all of these connection requests related to vulnerability scanning using a reconnaissance tool. So essentially what someone was trying to do was gain access to the device. And then the external device then requested to read data from a control unit, indicating access to potentially sensitive ICS information by an external party. Luckily, it was pretty harmless, but if it wasn't, that's an absolute shocker. Ultimately, it's a prime example of not just the AI's ability of having this really widespread visibility in this unified view across your entire IT and OT environment, but the ability to go super, super granular and fine-grained in terms of investigation of these anomalous connection attempts to internal devices outside the network. Now, essentially, that was a lot, but in conclusion, key things I would take away are: one, OT attacks have taken advantage of general trends in malware development and attack commoditization. They've gotten easier to achieve for a number of reasons. OT networks are firmly on the map for attackers and attractive because they've got outdated IT systems that they use. And fundamentally, a shift in using AI for these attacks is set to disrupt OT systems even further than they already have been by becoming much, much harder to detect at every single stage. So while legacy security tools have their place and are going to continue to filter out this lower level noise of known attacks, using self-learning AI that looks at an entirely different data set, which is your devices and what you guys are actually doing, and learning what's bespokely normal for your specific environment, is essentially the only way to defend against malicious AI and zero-day attacks that have never been seen before. But as I said at the beginning, I am literally paid by Darktrace to say that and make it sound absolutely amazing. The best way is to put proof in the pudding and try it for yourselves, which has always generated the best results because it is a trust-building exercise leveraging AI. And essentially evaluating yourself if it could add value to your business. Super easy to set up, takes a matter of hours, and then you guys get results in days. And if that sounds of interest, let's have a discussion at the booth afterwards. But either way, have a lovely day.
Johnny, thank you very, very much. Very enlightening. And yes, as we're seeing more complexity with the way threat actors are trying to force themselves upon businesses, it's good to see products and services out there that are very aligned to their own actions. Thank you very much indeed. And as previously stated, if you do want more information about the Darktrace products and services, just head over to the stand and the team will be happy to speak to you. Johnny, thank you very much indeed. Next speaker is someone who's no stranger to this event. He's attended it, I think, every year since it began and contributed to our events previously. So I'm delighted to welcome back Mark McRitchie from KCA Deutag. Mark, you're going to be speaking today about supporting business to adapt to new ways of working. A very, very pertinent topic at the moment in light of everything that's going on. So I'm going to give the floor to yourself, and thank you very much indeed.
Great, thanks, Ray. Good morning. I'm Mark McRitchie from KCA Deutag. Currently the IT and security architect. However, I wear many additional hats across the IT team. For those that are not aware of KCA Deutag, I thought I'd give a quick rundown of our operations. Not anything in great detail, but it will help maybe understand some of the discussion points I'm going to come on to. So we're over 100 years old. We have a number of business units and work streams. The predominant ones are land drilling, offshore services, rig design, and we have a subsidiary company that manufactures land rigs in the middle of the German forest. So those are the four sort of main business units. We operate around the world. We have a lot of land drilling happens in the Middle East, a lot of offshore in North Sea, both the Norwegian and the UK sectors, offshore Canada, offshore Sakhalin, onshore across all of Russia. So drilling in lots of hazardous environments in places that are not the sort of holiday destination of choice. Okay, so a few discussion areas. When I put this together, I thought I'm going to dive deep into some of these, but actually I'm going to skirt over some of them as I come onto them, because everybody has been talking about working from home. It was a year ago. Some of it is starting to blur to me as to what we did, how we made some of the decisions that we came to, and I think we'll all remember a year ago we were all like very happy. This is like finally we're getting to work from home. It's all new. It's all exciting. But from the IT and security point of view, how are we going to adapt to these changes? What have we got in place already? What do we need to make changes to? What we put in place? So this is a little bit about the people side of things and how the organizational how the organizational structure changed. A little bit on the scaling of services. So from the change in the way of working to the change in supporting the way of working, what we went through on the technology side. Then on business as the new usual, everyone's talking about the new normal. Business as usual. Is business still as usual? Is it new usual? I've always wanted to invent a buzzword. Banu, there we go. Let's go with that one. Some of the projects that we had on the go, on the boil, some that were in flight, some that were planned, what we did with those, how we reacted and changed the timeline that we were working to, and then a little bit about the lessons learned that we've had a number of reviews over the last year as to what went well, what went badly, and I'll speak a little bit about some of those. So working from home, we had a big step back to go, actually, we're changing the user distribution. People are moving from being desk-based to kitchen-based, people moving from working in the office to working in their kitchen, their bedroom, their living room. I feel particularly lucky that I have a space in my house where I can dedicate and I can close the door at the end of the day, so I have a good separation between my working life and my personal life. I know a lot of people are not as lucky, and a number of my staff are not as lucky either, but we've all moved and adapted. We have people who are used to moving around the world as part of their role. So IT field engineers, one of the verticals in our group that suddenly can't travel anymore. But we also have the engineering support people who are used to going to the rigs, can't go to the rigs anymore. But then we also have people who are still working on the rigs, have worked on the rigs for the last year. Rotational people, onshore, offshore, but also expats and locals who may or may not be traveling to the same degree that they were 12 months ago. So what we did was we looked at, for every one of our office locations, because the rigs were still going to continue drilling, still going to continue working, we hoped, for the office staff and the rolling staff, what was the change? People who are moving from being desk-based, do they have a laptop, or are they going to be using their personal device? If they need access to confidential information, for example, HR information, are they going to be able to access that from home? Do we want them to access that from home on their personal devices? do they have a company laptop? If they don't, can we get them one? And how do we make sure that that laptop has not been sitting in a cupboard for 6 months, a year, or longer? And if it has been sitting in a cupboard, how do we bring that up to being current? So personal devices was obviously a concern there. So how many people will be moving using personal devices? How many people will be using a company device on the VPN? And how many people are going to be still on net? How many people are still going to be going into the office, still going to be working at the sites? Because the other impact here that made things a little bit more complicated is being a global company, like so many in the energy sector. Every country applied its own rules to the pandemic for when to work from home, when you could return to the office. Our manufacturing facility in Germany moved to a shift-based social distance model to reduce the footfall. And some offices haven't really been home, some have been home, some are empty, some are not empty. Some have IT staff, some don't have IT staff. So we're very much looked at how we, what the profile change was in our user base between the ways that they would need to access their data to keep the business working. So what we looked at in terms of scaling of the services, some things can go up and down. So we looked at to support the change, are our comms links undersized? We didn't know. Unfortunately, comms links can be the sort of thing that can have a very long lead time, and we also didn't know what the restrictions would be on commissioning new links around the engineering side from third parties coming into buildings, going into data centers. So we had a bit of fingers crossed that we would be okay. In hindsight, we were. This is good. But as you'll remember, a year ago, we were all going to be back in the office by October. So we decided not to look at scaling down any of the comms links, because there could have been a potential cost saving. However, with the lead time associated with a lot of this work and the unknowns around access, we decided that actually it's not worth the pain and suffering and effort to go through to save what might not be a huge amount of money. But on the underside side, we were reasonably confident that we would be able to support the business with the links that we had, and we wouldn't need to increase where we were at. On the internet-facing side, we had to look at the web gateways for access to some of our web-based services for people who would be accessing from their personal devices. We were comfortable there, that was okay. But on the VPN gateways, we had a little bit of a challenge. So we had a 50% capacity utilization on our existing gateways, which under normal circumstances would see us through any sort of bursts or spike in load. However, like many companies, we didn't quite anticipate an 800% spike in our load. So this was a big challenge for us on the VPN side. So that's something where we had to take a real step back, because the gateways that we were using were nearing end of life. So they were on the horizon to be replaced anyway. Did we stay with the same technology? Well, actually, yes, because we're having to move really fast here. We don't have time to do a proof of concept of 2 or 3 or even 1 different competing technology. So how do we get the new gateways? Okay, well, let's just buy a bigger model and get them in. Okay, so we're looking at that route, and then I was on a call with a different business unit of the vendor that we have them from, and I was chatting through with them, and they're like, well, why don't you just get virtual? Like, I didn't think the virtual appliances supported this VPN. Oh no, they do. Okay, great. And the chap I was speaking to had a quick look at their systems and was like, yeah, and you'll need to go VPN because the last physical appliances that would suit you shipped last week in the UK, and they're now on a very long lead time. Okay, fantastic. So we worked with our procurement team and vendor and the partner that we procure through, because very few things in IT let you actually buy directly from the vendor. We managed to secure purchase order to get out through to our partner, who placed it back to back with the vendor, and in a few days we had the licenses for the virtual appliances. And because it was exactly the same technology, we could copy the config across and scale them up to a ridiculously high number that is way bigger than we'd ever need. So that was a challenge, and very much at that point the business was waiting for us to have the VPNs in place before they could pull the trigger on the whole pivot to work from home, to throw everybody out of the office because they would be able to work from home. Our existing VPN gateways had been hitting their capacity, and people had been getting denied connections because people were not necessarily waiting for working from home to be given the go-ahead. They were being thrown out of the offices already, or they had various personal risks as well that they had to. They wanted to make sure they were safe. Software deployment, so supporting the pivot. We had to make sure that there was productivity software, that the required productivity software was installed where necessary and accessible to users who would not be accessing from a company device. And we also had to make sure that the security software that supported the protection of our corporate assets, environment, and data was appropriately deployed. A lot of that tied into the VPN. We were in the middle of a project, which I'll come on to shortly, around the existing VPN, which would have required an upgrade to that software anyway. And that was an interesting project and didn't quite go as smoothly as we would have hoped, given the timescales involved. And then, of course, the new requirements we had were not just around how fast can we deploy this, but how fast can we procure it. We had some additional licensing that was being offered as a special offer. Some vendors, not all, but some vendors were realizing that actually we can come out of this looking really good and developing and building on the relationships that we have with our customers. So we're offering special deals on things that were ephemeral, giving you some more licenses to run services on your own environment. There's no cost to them. It was great. We took advantage of an offer to increase some of our remote access licensing for the non-VPN access, or the access gateway piece, people coming into remote desktop environments and so on, because we weren't entirely sure what we would need to support or how that would change over time in the coming months. So we managed to take that as a 1-year subscription, short-term offer. It was good. We managed to, again, work with our supply chain, get a purchase order out fairly quickly, and with a good relationship with our vendors, that licensing got turned around very quickly, and we were able to move ahead. So, business as usual, protecting our staff. Before the business decided we need to move to, well, we can move to working from home because IT have put the necessary pieces in place. People were already moving, as I've said. I remember distinctly looking around the office in the lead up to the I think it was the 17th of March 2020, looking around and going, okay, everybody's really busy. Everyone's got their head down. Everybody in the global infrastructure team, actually, it's everybody in the global infrastructure team is sitting in the office. We had no idea how infectious the coronavirus was at that time. So before the official trigger was pulled, very much, okay, we need to split the team up, and we started rotating them through the office because I didn't want the possibility of the whole team being taken out by the coronavirus all at once. not taken out, but unable to work. Is the wrong phrase. How do we support people? Everyone's working at home. What happens if their machine fails? People who are working on site, what happens if their machine fails? How do we support them? Yes, on a day-to-day basis, we don't touch a lot of the hardware that we support and manage. It's at the other end of the planet. We don't physically touch switches. We don't physically touch PCs. However, it's not as much of a challenge to get that bit of equipment to somebody who's technical. How do we do that going forward? A lot of people have been through this, running click and collect type operations out of their offices, where people are dropping off bags, collecting bags of equipment, all that sort of good stuff. And then the travel restrictions. We had a lot of projects on the go where our field support engineers were lined up to move between site to site to site in a chain, and suddenly they can't leave. Or there are restrictions or quarantine. So is it actually worth sending them to a country where they'll have to stay in a hotel for 2 weeks to do 2 days worth of work? We were very close to sending our engineers to one country to do a bit of work around about December time. Then we became a bit reticent about sending them. We were about to pull the trigger on the travel, and then suddenly the country that they were going to close its border. So that was not necessarily something that we could deal with. But how do we deal with this going forward in the new world? Because while everybody is getting vaccinated in the UK, it's not necessarily the same in all of the countries that we operate in. So projects that we had on the boil when we started the pivot last year. We had a NAC implementation. Okay, this for those not aware, NAC is a network security piece that authenticates devices as they connect to your network and can make some decisions around blocking or allowing them access to certain resources. So we were about to go live with this in our HQ, using that as a nice template. We'll do it in the HQ, and then we'll roll it site to site to site. So we stopped that. What we didn't want to do is continue with that and have the office empty. Then everybody comes back to the office, and then it doesn't work. So we thought 6 months, we'll put this on, we'll stop this, we'll come back to it later in the year, and we won't do it when everybody is out of the office. Simultaneous to the NAC implementation, we were changing our web security product from one to another. And again, we didn't want to do this and roll it globally while nobody's in the office. It looks good to us, and then suddenly thousands of people come back to working in the office, and then it doesn't work, and they're all logging tickets at the same time. So we stopped that. That became a challenge for us because the product we were migrating from was end of life. We ended up because we have a good relationship with the vendor, they spun it for longer and longer for us. And then eventually we had to sign the paper that said we accept that this is not supported to move forward with it, and that everything's on best effort. So this is good. So it's fine, because it would have also meant a change to the thousands of endpoints that were remoting in over the VPN, and we very much didn't want to disrupt people's working life, how they accessed the company resources and internet-based resources from their laptops. We're very much sitting on this because we were going back in October, but as time went on, eventually I got an email from an engineer at the company saying we're decommissioning one of our data centers on Friday. This was the point where we realized, actually, we've been sitting for too long on this. We need to move forward. So we did move forward with it at a speed that we were not intending to. So what was expected to be a 4-month project took us 4 weeks. And the problem that raised its head was, instead of having a slow trickle of issues across a number of months as we implemented on every site. We had this high curve of issues that all came in at once. So all the issues were not more, they were just more clustered together. So that was a bit of a challenge. And it also led to some reputational issues because of the perception that there was a huge amount of issues where it was expected, just not at once. What other projects did we do? We started, like a lot of companies, we've been humming and hawing and kind of kicking around the ball about migrating to Teams. We used to use Skype on-prem. Never really moved to Skype for the cloud. It didn't particularly suit us. But when we realized that we'd have to have a tool that would enable better collaboration with the remote teams, remote way of working, we started a project to implement Teams and roll that out. It's still ongoing. We're still doing a lot of governance, but it's going. We're happy with the way it's going, and it's a fantastic uptake from the business. The other project, obviously, was the very quick implementation of the VPN upgrade, but that was very much a behind-the-scenes upgrade. It's not very not very client-facing, so nobody particularly appreciated that there was a lot of work went on behind that, other than the fact that they could suddenly connect to the VPN now, whereas they were getting blocked before. Other projects with the security event that we continued with a little bit of a pause. I'm not going to lie, there was a little bit of a pause, but we felt that we could continue with these easier than some of the ones that we stopped. We had Windows 10 servicing, so how we were servicing our Windows 10 feature updates between the versions, and also the update deployment. So we were getting changing the way that we deployed our updates, using Config Manager a lot more to give us assurance and reporting around the update deployment and our compliance. So we continued with those. We made some changes that meant that the clients are going directly to Microsoft and pulling their updates, their servicing bundles from Microsoft over the internet, so not backhauling over our corporate VPN. So we do a lot of, we've always done a lot of split tunneling with our VPN, so that internet destined traffic goes all the way off to cloud-based proxy servers from our providers, not pulling it back to the data center and applying traffic there. So it doesn't matter where in the world you are, if you're at home, if you're in a hotel, if you're in the office, you get the same web policy, the same amount of wrap from the security function anywhere. So it doesn't matter if somebody's in a hotel, if they try and access a phishing site, they've got the same level of protection as they are in the office. I know a lot of companies actually struggled with that because they never really had this concept of a split tunnel VPN. It was very much the user had to start the VPN or stop the VPN. And I found it bizarre when I hear the stories about, oh yes, I have to come off the VPN so I can access the betting website or whatever it is. Okay. So some of the lessons that we learned from that, don't delay. Don't put off things longer than you have to. We put projects off too long. Get on with them if you can. We all thought this was going to be a 6 month delay. We're now a year out of the office. It's going to be some months before we get back into the office in the UK still. It's different globally. We're working in a new dynamic. If you can't delay, don't. Replan, work out when you actually need to do stuff. But with the changing guidelines worldwide, it's a lot harder to plan. I appreciate that, but try and keep things rolling, keep things moving. Protect equally, as I said, make sure that your assets are protected, whether they're on or off the network. Make sure you've got the same security wrap that means that your data, your assets, your people are safe. You wouldn't only scan files for viruses on the network, but not when someone's laptop's at home. Don't do the same with their internet. That's a massive target. Don't let people access things on corporate devices that they couldn't access in the office. Don't split tunnel where necessary, absolutely. But if there's no need to take all of that internet traffic back to your data center to then break it out through a proxy server to the internet and applying policy at that point. There's plenty of options these days for having an agent that looks at the traffic, looks at where it's going, and applies policies at the endpoint or directly in the cloud. Everything's moving to the cloud. Why are you pulling this back to the office? And lastly, vendor relationships. We could not have executed some of the things that we did as fast as we did without having a really good relationship with our suppliers and our vendors. So that's not just the manufacturers that we deal with, that's also the partners in the ecosystem that we work directly with. Having a good relationship with these people meant that they were able to come to us with options that we could execute quite quickly and at a cost that was very achievable, especially given the ongoing. There's no, we didn't have any price gouging coming from our vendors or anybody trying to take advantage of the situation for commercial gain. None of that went on, which I was very, very happy with, and definitely helps us feel good about moving forward with the relationships that we have in the future. Okay, so I've come in a little early, Ray. So hopefully
that's forgivable, Mark. That's forgivable. there is actually a question, actually. So your timing is actually perfect.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah.
One question that I've just noted here is obviously you've moved from basically, you know, in terms of personnel in an on-premise work environment, everybody's in the office, or at least the vast majority are, to then spinning back out to and reversing that to having the vast majority of your personnel at KCA working remotely. As lockdown is lifted, as restrictions are lifted, and the prediction is, I think by the end of June, we're going to go back to level 0, social distancing will be dropped. Obviously, are your teams going to have the option to work in a hybrid fashion? Are you going to say to everybody right now restrictions are down, you know, it's all in the office? You may not know the answer to that question yet, but in a scenario-based question, what would the cybersecurity complexities be for you if you did have staff working in a hybrid fashion? Is that going to increase the complexity, or do you think you've already covered that in the fashion you've been working over the past 12 months?
So I think that because we always took the ethos of having an equal level of protection on and off the network, that when people move between sites, move between locations, whether that's our offices, our rigs, offshore locations, or their home, Starbucks, we've got the same level of protections that we're applying to those endpoints. So coming back to the office, I actually saw an email this morning there were some surveys that went out as to what people were actually looking for. And we're looking to gradually maybe move some people back to the office on a basis of maybe a week about. But again, this is going to depend massively on what the restrictions are worldwide. Yeah. Our manufacturing plant in Germany is operated all the way through at a restricted headcount, but there's still been people on site. The Aberdeen HQ has been mostly empty. A few people dotting in and about. Reception are still there, taking in people's Amazon parcels they forgot to get sent to their house instead. Yeah, so the fact that we have always taken the mindset of we want to make a consistent application of policy has been was a huge benefit to us, because we didn't suddenly have to make massive deployments of security software. It was already on the endpoints that they were moving out. The only thing that we had to cut, that we did have a concern around, was our CAD people who have massive chunky CAD workstations, high-end graphics cards for all the design work that they do. There was a lot of discussion about should they take these home or not. And then actually they need to be close to the data that they work with. So if they take these PCs home, then they have to take a big chunk of the data that they're working with, which is not necessarily our data, it could be our client's data. And actually that's not going to work either, because this guy needs to collaborate on the same project as this guy, so they can't both have copies of the data. So we need to have that in the office, and they need to come in remotely to these PCs that they can access that with. So there was a lot of talk, not just on the security side, but the tools that we use around the security, but where people are accessing the data from, and how are they accessing the data, where the data sits, and trying not to let it be dripped out or have anything particularly confidential saved down at home PCs.
Super. Mark, thank you very much indeed. Always a pleasure to have you back. Hopefully we'll see you in Aberdeen next year and get back to the social calendar which we attach to the event normally, and have a bite to eat the night before. But as ever, we're very grateful for your contribution and wish you all the best. Thank you very much indeed. Right, folks, last speaker, and by no means at least an outstanding speaker who graced the Digit stage, virtual stage, back in March at Scott Secure. A recent addition to the Barrier Networks team is Jordan Schroeder. Jordan's going to be talking today about the story of the evolution of the ECANS ransomware on OT. Obviously a big talk at the minute. Ransomware has had a huge effect on the oil and gas industry, certainly with the Maersk attack a year or two ago. So lessons have been learnt, but obviously something we have to be ever vigilant on. Jordan, I'm going to hand the floor over to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much, Ray. Hi, my name is Jordan Schroeder, and I am a managing CISO. And the talk, what I want to talk to you about today is a story. And there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of media, especially early last year, on ECANS. And most of the material that I found and most of the writings that I found have been very, very technical. It's been a technical deep dive into the ransomware and what it does. And what I'm finding, though, is that I think a story has been missed. I think we're not seeing the forest through the trees. And so what I want to do is a non-technical, mostly non-technical discussion of ECANS and what it means for oil and gas, what it means for OT, and how you, as someone in oil and gas, can start looking at bolstering your defenses at a higher level, at more of a managerial and more of a risk management level than a technical level. So I want to have this discussion. I want to tell this story at a certain level, and hopefully this is something that will be useful for you, and you'll be able to look at the problem in a slightly different light. First off, energy is hot right now. And it is really, really hot for attackers. IBM did an analysis between the volume of attacks between the different sectors, and they've ranked this every year. Between 2019 and 2020, manufacturing and energy shot to the top of the list, underneath financial sector. This, of course, is understandable. Financial sector is probably always going to be number one, because why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. But what we saw from IBM's report was that manufacturing and energy shot to number 2 and number 3, far above anybody else. Nobody else saw the same leap in attack volume on their industry, on their verticals. And a big reason for this was an OT focus on attacks. This is very, very interesting. I've talked to some oil and gas security folks, and they've said that they've seen a huge impact and a huge increase in attacks, a lot of COVID traps, a lot of COVID-related things. And most of them, as I've been talking to them, most of them have seemed to say that, they thought it was a blip or they thought it was just them. Well, it's not just them. It's the industry as a whole is getting, well, if I can say it, it's just getting hammered right now. And attackers are finding that they can make their way into oil and gas manufacturing, OT, ICS environments, and they are learning fast. Up until recently, OT and ICS has had the convenience of assuming that they're not going to be a high target because there's a high barrier to entry to learn how to attack OT, ICS type environments. It requires specialist knowledge. It requires specialist knowledge of the protocols, the software, which is not often freely available, and access to the devices. So all of these things create these impediments to even learning how to hack or attack OT and ICS environments. That is, until someone does gain that access and then automates the attack. And this is happening. FireEye did a survey of the various attack tools that are used to help automate and help make attacks or security testing more reliable as a testing process. They looked at the top 3 tools used by security testers used to test networks, either IT or OT networks. We've got Metasploit on here. We have Immunity on here. We have the top 3 tools. These are used and intended to be used by security professionals to test the security of their target environment. In order to make it efficient, people produce, not just those companies, but individuals like security professionals, security researchers, produce plugins that they load into these platform tools to make it easier, faster, and more efficient to test. These are not only available to security testers, these tools are also available to attackers. And they do utilize these tools. They're freely available. The automations are already written, so why not use them? And so they took a look at the different types of functions that these OT plugins provide. And what's interesting here, from someone who is a former malware researcher, there's some really interesting numbers here, which provide some speculation at a story going on. You have network discovery and you have software exploitation as your top plugins for these three platform tools. And this is not surprising. And we saw the same type of a breakdown in IT in these tools a while ago. When you're an attacker and you're needing to learn how to attack a target, attack a specific target, how to attack a specific target type, what you do is you start gathering information. So your focus and all your energy and your development efforts go into gathering as much information as possible and making sense of it. Secondary to that is that you use the known vulnerabilities that are in the software in your target environment and take advantage of those. Those are exploits. So you develop and you put development in resources into exploiting those and making them automated and repeatable. And then as you start to learn more and as you start to explore more, as you start playing more, then these other functions start to grow and you start to develop more and more of those. For me, this graph from FireEye points at a beginning stage of learning for attackers for how to deal with OT environments. This is very, very reminiscent for what I've seen for instance, Metasploit 10 years ago, right? Or a long time ago. Let's not give my age too much. And what I'm predicting then for OT and for oil and gas is these numbers are going to increase. And everything on the left side, all the smaller numbers, those numbers are also going to increase. And we're going to see much more functionality coming out of these tools. FireEye's survey of the tool set also looked at the vendors. And you've got a lot of the typical vendors that you would expect, but you can also assume that this number is going to grow. The more that attackers learn, the more that security researchers learn, the more that the industry learns, the more will be added. Now, this list is just the vendors who have these plugins that have more than 10. So more than 10 plugins for these tools. So you've got a long tail, which is not represented here, of a whole bunch of other vendors which have maybe not as many plugins. This graph over the next 2 years will change quite significantly, and more vendors will be added over time. Now, it is into this environment, it is into this type of ecosystem, this attack ecosystem of OT, oil and gas, and manufacturing being targeted, getting really, really hot. You have an increase in automation in attacks also happening. You've got these platform tools which are being leveraged and being developed, and more being developed on top of them. It is into this environment that ECAN shows up. Now, this is really interesting. The image that we have here, of course, is of the Pokemon ECANs. For those of you who are not familiar with the ECANs ransomware, ECANs is snake spelled backwards. It calls itself ECANs when it does its work, and when it encrypts the files, it appends ECANs at the end. So that's how it got its name. It called itself that. So into this environment, we have ECANs. Now, ECANs caused quite a bit of a stir when it came out. Dragos was probably the first to really publicize this and make this well known. And at the beginning of 2020, there was a lot of news on ECANs and what it meant, because it was the first ransomware that seemed to be very highly and specialized for OT environments. And this being the first meant that this is probably the first of many. But let's take a look at what happened, and let's take a look at ECANs at a high level. I can get into the technical things if you really want to, but I want to take this time to take a look at things at a higher level and take a look at what happened over time and what happened over 2020 and what that might mean for what's going to happen next, because I think there's an interesting story here. Okay. If you haven't heard of ECANs or know what it's about, I'm going to do a quick overview. First, ECANs targets ICS processes, and there are a few specific processes and specific software that is mentioned. It's hard-coded into the ransomware. We got GE software, Honeywell, FlexNet, Sentinel, ThingWorx. But mostly we're dealing with historians and we're dealing with licensing servers. These aren't, the really heavy-hitting processes in an ICS environment, admittedly. And that's not a problem. But what this means is if these processes get interrupted, if they get stopped, which is what ECANs does, you then lose a lot of visibility in your systems. Everything might still work, but you're losing some functionality. And of course, the software, the server that ECANs is on gets completely locked down with encryption. So it becomes unusable. So you can take a look at this list and you might say, well, I don't use those, or if I lost those things, that's not a really big deal for me. And that might be completely valid, but know that this list can also easily change. It's just a matter of changing what the process name is, and you can totally and radically change this list. What it does is also kind of interesting. It doesn't do anything too very different from what other ransomware might do, other IT ransomware might do, but it has a couple interesting features here. And for me, some of these features indicate something very interesting. One, it confirms when it runs that it's in the target company. It wakes up, it runs, and first thing it does, it checks, am I at the target company that I've been programmed to hit? And this is what we saw in the samples that we have from the infections that have happened in the wild. There were hard-coded company names and company networks that it needed to be in order for the rest of its features to run. It starts looking for the Windows domain controllers. It wants to be able to look for these central controllers in the Windows-based network environments, because it can gain a lot more access as a result. It can gain passwords, administrator credentials. It can also potentially start propagating itself to the rest of the Windows network. Now, there's a big asterisk here, and there's some technical things here, and some of you might know the technical bit of ECANs, and you might be saying, wait a minute, there's more to it than that. And I'm going to say, yes, there is a lot more to it than that, but I'm not going to get into the technical bits right now. And I'll explain a little bit more in just a second. So yes, there is an asterisk there. Don't worry about that. One of the things that it does do, and this feature was added partway through 2020, is that it turns off the firewall on the server that's run. So it wakes up, it confirms that it's in your environment. It then looks for certain features on the network and on the server, and then the first thing it does is shuts down the firewall so that no incoming communication can come in. This is a very, very useful feature for ransomware because it means that if you noticed it immediately and you wanted to do something, if you wanted to send commands to the agents on that server, if you wanted to remotely administer it, if you wanted to do anything remotely, you can't, right? It has locked down that server in order for it to then do what it does. So it does this, and then it stops processes. It stops a whole bunch of Windows processes and security processes and backups and antivirus and a whole bunch of these things. And those are pretty standard. Those are the types of things you'll see in a lot of ransomware. It starts killing the backups, and there's lots of different types of backup types. There's shadow copies and tape backups, and there's a bunch of things that it looks for backups. Because why does it do this? In order to recover from ransomware, your biggest defense is your backups. So it looks to kill those. And then it starts encrypting the files and starts doing what it normally does. And then it turns the firewall back on. It turns it off. It allows the traffic to resume. So what you might see from a central point or from your SIEM or from a central monitoring point, that this server went down for a little bit, but now it's back up. Right. But now it's not behaving properly, but at least it's back up. And depending upon the robustness of your monitoring, that might be all you get, except for the fact that this server is now completely encrypted and you don't have access to various functions of it anymore. So that's what it does, right? It's really ICS and OT focused. It's looking for specific things. And it in terms of its function, it's not revolutionary as ransomware. There's a lot of IT ransomware that does very much the same things. So that is not strange. And that's part of what worries me. And I'll explain why. Here's the timeline for ECANs. In mid-2019, there was a ransomware called Megacortex 2. It was, again, not revolutionary, not huge. It did some interesting things that other ransomware didn't do, fair enough, but it was fairly generic, and it was fairly uninteresting, uninspiring, except for the fact that it was ransomware. In December 2019, December later that year, ECANS was first discovered. And it was discovered at BAPCO, which is the Bahraini national oil company. And it appears as though this was from a BAPCO infection. We don't know. There's nothing confirmed. But the malware, the ECANS had the BAPCO domain written into it. So it was targeting that particular environment. And what was also interesting is that ECANS did absolutely the same things that Megacortex did. It even had the same list of processes, but a subset, and I'll get into that in a second. So it's really, 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 really similar. It's almost as if Megacortex 2 was a big template, and then they took a slice of it, almost word for word, code for code, line for line, to make it focused for OT and ICS. It was discovered in December 2019. 2020, Dragos starts analyzing it, starts understanding what it's doing, and then releases this knowledge to the public. And there was a lot of media coverage called the Media Blitz for January 2020 and the beginning of February. And then things went quiet. There wasn't anything else that really happened. In May, a hospital group gets hit, and it's not publicly confirmed, but there is a lot of indications that it was ECANS. And then in June, Honda and NL Group gets hit with ECANS as well. And we have those samples of that malware to take a look at and explore. It's these samples which give us this deeper look into how it works. Now, like I said, this isn't supposed to be a technical discussion. I want to look at this from a risk perspective, and I want to tell this higher level story. Megacortex 2 scans and looks for over 1,600 processes. This is an insane number. This is overkill in terms of what processes to look for and what processes to kill for ransomware. It's almost too big. In this long list, there happen to be some OT things. Now, the same OT processes that were in ECANS. Now, the researchers took a look at this, and they sound the warning to the OT security people, saying, we've got some OT things here, but we don't know what to make of it because it's in this list of so many things. We don't know if this is a threat or not. We don't know what this means, right? But it's here. ECANS comes out and it's got the core list of processes. There's 64 processes in all. It's got these core processes that basically every ransomware looks for. And then the list of OT processes from Megacortex 2. And there's the software that I mentioned earlier, the GE and the ThingWorks, Honeywell and Sentinel. Then in the samples looked at in May 2020, there are slight improvements to the code. Now, these are tiny. These are small. These are tiny inefficiencies. There was some code in the original ECANs that was a little inefficient, and those inefficiencies were dealt with. Where they were removed. Things were made more efficient. As a malware researcher, this scares me. It scares me for a specific reason. I'll talk about that in a second. Now, in June, in the next month, and the other samples that were provided from Honda, there's even more improvement, more efficiencies in the code, and a couple more features. One of these features being that they turn the firewall on at the start to block all incoming communications, and then it does its things. The reason this causes me concern is that we're looking at small iterative improvements in code. For anyone who's done software development, you kind of understand this process. You know this process. These are not huge changes. These are not, oh, this isn't working, therefore we need to change it. These are the types of processes and the types of improvements you'd put in place when things are working, when things are doing what you want, but you found ways to make it a little bit better. This means, we can suppose, right? And I don't know the developers. I don't know who's involved. But from an outside perspective, what we're seeing here is active development and active improvement on the software. That supposedly is working as intended. Things are working well. They're happy with it. They're making tiny changes. Just like you would if you're a software developer and you've released code and it's production ready, and yeah, you make some tweaks as you go. So this concerns me. So let's put it all together. Like let's throw all of these facts together. For me, as a former malware researcher, for someone taking a look at this from a software development point of view, ECANS is a plugin in a platform. This is what it's acting like. Right, I'm making a lot of speculations, and I'm looking at it from a very high view. But I'm looking at ECANS as being like a plugin in an attack platform, just like I talked about at the beginning about these attack platforms and these plugins in order to attack your targets or test your targets in certain ways. I'm seeing this behavior, and I've seen this behavior before in IT environments. That this is how you do your plugin development. You have an ability to specifically target a certain environment, and you can then very easily change your processes for how you want to attack it and what effect you want to have. That scares me more than the specifics of what actually happens or what the lists are or what domains were actually hit. This scares me more. Because this means and this indicates that there is growing competency in the attacker world to attack OT ICS environments, and they're automating it. And it looks like they are working to the next stage. What is potentially the next stage? We are used to viruses that are all in one. You release the virus, it hits a target, it does its thing, it's done. That's not what ransomware is doing right now. Ransomware in this current environment, in the IT world everywhere, that ransomware is a part of a wider attack. You have a combination of human-assisted and automated processes that are chained together in order to make an attack. So you find a way in, you find a way to infect a machine in your environment, whatever way that is. And there could be a million different ways, right? There's lots of different ways to try and get this malware in. You try to infect, and by the way, if you're infected and you're not in the environment, it's not going to do anything, right? It wakes up, it checks to see if it's in the network environment that it needs to be in before it does its work. Now, in 2021, we all understand the concept of asymptomatic infections. And that's what ECANS is. Right? Until it's where it needs to be, it doesn't do anything. But when it is where it needs to be, then it does its work. Now, I also highlight that we have a lot of workers that are going to be bringing their equipment and their computers back to the office. And we just had a presentation on that very thing, mentioning that. So you need to be prepared for, have a plan for at least what happens if these computers coming in have an asymptomatic infection that is going to wake up as soon as it changes where it's being plugged into and what network it connects to. So ECANs then can be used in this way, or something like it, right? I'm not specific to ECANs, but this is the approach. This is the development approach. This is the attack approach. It can then start infecting the entire OT network. Remember I said it looks for those Windows domain controllers? And yes, there is there's an asterisk there, right? And the code that we've seen doesn't have specific capability to move forward. But as a part of an attack where the attacker has the ability to go from machine to machine, then ECANs becomes a very important part and become a very interesting part in order to gain access and maintain access in an environment. And then I predict we are going to see a different type of ransom in the ransomware. Right now, we have an idea of, the notice comes up saying, we've encrypted your files, pay us Bitcoin or whatever in order to gain access. But if they're going to be playing with OT and ICS processes, they now have the potential to do more than just encrypt things, lock things down, and shut things down, right? Because that's what things are doing now. That's the easiest thing to do. That's where they are right now. The next step would be pay us Bitcoin within an hour, or we'll start shutting down pumps. And this is a shoot the hostage situation. Every 15 minutes, if we don't get paid, we'll start shutting down pumps. And this is the type of attack that I predict, and the type of ransom that we might be seeing next. And we need to have a plan. In IT, what we've seen for major runaway outbreak infections is you shut down the entire network. You just shut everything down, you disconnect everything, and you start rebuilding your servers from scratch. This is not always possible or feasible in an OT network. And you might be looking at me saying, Jordan, this is absolutely not possible. Fair enough. I don't want to make absolute statements. But this is something that we need to prepare for in a very unique way. If you cannot shut down your OT environments, then you need to design and test and prepare for running your OT and ICS networks while an infection is happening, with live infection. And that requires special design, special protections, and special response processes to be able to handle that. First off, my recommendation, you need to be planning for when this happens, not if. And this is a common phrase that's been said in cybersecurity forever. And I think I really want to push this idea in OT, because the barrier to entry is lowering fast, and ECANs is an indication of just how far and how fast that barrier is falling. So start planning your processes, start planning what you need to do for when it happens, not if. You need to be looking at your network, your zone, your conduit designs, and not just from an architectural point of view, although that needs to happen as well. You need to be able to look at this. You need visibility in these zones and in these networks. You need a really high visibility in the inventory, in data flows, in the security of the data classification. You need to be able to define all this and bring in an assessor to look at this, test it, regularly review it, and make sure it is going to be resilient and still work and give you what you need operationally if something like ECANs hits your environment. When something like ECANs hits your environment. The next thing is to, of course, patch and update, and to automate this as much as possible. And I know. Automating patches can be a nightmare, I will agree with you in many cases, it's not going to be possible. Automate where possible. And if you can't automate it with technology, at least automate it through manual process. Have a means of updating, discovering that things need to be updated, for one. That's easy to automate through tech. And then work out your processes to go through and update these because ransomware and these longer types of infections, these more complex, more sophisticated attacks, rely on vulnerabilities in your software and operating systems, so they need to be addressed. And then, of course, anomaly detection. We had a presentation at the beginning at 11 o'clock from Darktrace, and they have an AI-based anomaly detection, but there's so many other types of anomaly detections that you need to do. We have a skill shortage in trying to do it manually, and doing log reviews manually is possibly just simply out of the question. But you can bring in a lot of different technologies in order to look for anomalies in how the software is running, how the operating system's running, how the network's running, the data flows, the network traffic. There's a lot of things you can do to look for these anomalies and look for these long tail, long strung out attacks where ECANS is merely the end of that chain, not the beginning or the sole link in that chain. And these anomaly detections can help. And bringing in an advisor, bringing in someone to help you design that and look for your highest points of leverage for the greatest effect will also do you in good stead to find where your baseline is, where your normals are, and how to find when things are simply not right. And that's going to become more important as all your networks are going to change really, really rapidly as people come back to work. So thank you very, very much. And I hope that this was non-technical enough, but was able to tell this story and try to describe the forest, because all of the research I've seen on ECANS and ECANS-like stuff is so technical that I think a story was lost. And I hope I was able to bring that story some more clarity and some more visibility.